Live from the SABC's Auckland Park headquarters. Welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show this evening,
government should allocate additional funding towards the implementation of the proposed pensionable salary increases for 2022-23, as well as the carry-through costs over the 2023 MTEF.
A looming public sector strike that could seriously cripple the economy. However, Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi still thinks that it can be avoided. According to the Finance Minister, though, whatever agreement can be reached between the government and Labour, that must be done before he tables his budget speech tomorrow afternoon. We look at the implications, but we're also trying to clear whatever confusion the statements that were made today may have created. And with one of the government's key arguments being there won't be money for additional headcounts in frontline services if it can pay public servants more than it can afford. We look at how far those in charge have gone to determine whether we have the right caliber of public servants with the right skills, behavior, and ethos. The Watchdog starts now. Acting Public Service and Administration Minister Thulas Nxesi says the government will ask for the intervention of the CCMA as a last resort to break the deadlock with organised labour. He also dismissed claims that he has withdrawn the wage offer that the government had tabled earlier. Nxesi says the final offer of an average of 7.5% by government remains available and has not been withdrawn as reported in the media. The minister says government will ask for the intervention of the CCMA as a last resort to break the deadlock with organised labour.
Finance Minister Inogo Ngwana will have a fine balancing act to play during his mid-term budget speech tomorrow. The Public Servants Association has rejected a salary increase offer from government, which they pinned at 3%.
Lastly, I would like to report that all parties to the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Chamber, which we call the SABC, have been advised of the need to engage and settle the matter of wages. The final offer of an average of 7.5% by the government remains available, and I must emphasize, has not been withdrawn as it has been purported in the media.
The PSA filed a notice to strike yesterday. They are set to meet the employer at the CCMA tomorrow for talks. Government is hoping for an agreement before the minister delivers his mid-term budget speech.
On 17th October, I received a letter from the Minister of Finance stating that, and I quote, "I wish to inform you that it is my view that government should allocate additional funding towards the implementation of the proposed pensionable salary increases for 2022-23, as well as the carry-through costs over the 2023 MTEF. This is because there will not be another opportunity to implement funding for wage increases in the current year once the medium-term budget policy statement is tabled."
60% of the country's budget goes to the public sector wage bill. It's not clear what portion of this percentage goes to the salaries of ministers and their deputies. Elrise Mashaba, SABC News, Parliament.
Acting Public Service and Administration Minister Thulas Nxesi speaking during a media briefing in Parliament earlier today. Now, the government's position as the employer and the custodian of the national fiscus is that it is fully engaged with the issue of the rising cost of living, which is an issue that Labour is, of course, raising quite sharply, including, they say, respect for public servants. Nevertheless, the government is primarily responsible for ensuring that the wage bill is sustainable in the context of maintaining a healthy national fiscus. This, the government says, is to ensure that there is sufficient resources for funding South Africa's development agenda, while also avoiding sinking the country into a debt hole and unsustainable fiscal deficits. But the other reason the government has advanced for refusing to accede to Labour's wage demands is that higher than inflationary, or as they say, unaffordable adjustments on the salaries of the current public servants would mean that there will be less money available to increase headcounts in critical frontline services. Put simply, the government is arguing that there won't be money for additional people to be employed to keep up with increasing demand for public services. We're talking here about police, nurses, teachers, and so on. In other words, if it dishes out more money, it will not be able to hire more police, more teachers, more nurses, and so on. And yet, on the other hand, you also hear talk from the government, but also, of course, from people outside the government who are looking in, who say, we have a bloated public service in South Africa. Now, according to Minister Nxesi, the government is looking at a professionalization framework that will ensure that South Africa has a single public service administration that applies to all spheres, whether local, provincial, or national. But this is additionally to ensure that we have qualified individuals who are competent, who are appointed to positions that are essentials. In other words, to ensure that we have the requisite numbers of public servants who can police, who can teach, who can nurse, and do all these things. But also, we need to ensure that that public service is transformed, it's capable, it's ethical, it's developmental, it's people-oriented, and all these wonderful things. Now, sitting alongside the minister this morning, where he said all these things, was the chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and that is Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, who joins us on the line from Cape Town, where that briefing was held earlier today. Also part of this conversation is Ivor Chipkin, who is a director of the Government and Public Policy think tank, GAP. He works with and has written extensively on these matters. Good evening to both of you gentlemen, and thanks very much for agreeing to come on the program.
Thank you for inviting us, and greetings to your viewers.
Yes, thank you for your...
Hey, it's great to have you indeed. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Fikeni. Perhaps the thinking and the reason behind the creation of this single public service that can do all these things we all hope for and aspire to.
Well, the main thinking there is to prevent fragmentation that makes it difficult to have standardization when you are making changes towards professionalization. Hence, then you work towards creating a single public service and public administration. Right now, you have one set of rules for public servants, another set of rules for state-owned companies, another set of rules for local government, another set of rules for employees in parliament. So that is the first idea behind creating this single public service. And of course, I will then be able to speak to the other elements as to why professionalization was necessary. And that would start from the Constitution, Chapter 10, which envisaged an ethical, developmental public service. And it goes on to the Professor Kader Small's paper, which was reviewing public service and proposed professionalization. The National Development Plan, Chapter 13, talks about building state capacity and professionalization of public service, which will make it possible for service delivery, make it possible for the state to implement policies and so on. And more recently, all crises from corruption to management of disasters finally convinced everybody that you can't do all these other things and arrest them without building state capacity through professionalizing public service and make it meritocratic.
Now, Ivo, I'm reading here a couple of lines from the very first State of the Nation address that President Cyril Ramaphosa gave, which was his maiden sona as the president before, of course, the 2019 elections. And it reads, building growth, development and transformation depends on a strong and capable state. It is critical that the structure and size of the state is optimally suited to meet the needs of the people and ensure the most efficient allocation of public resources. We will therefore initiate a process to review the configuration, number and size of national government departments. Now, a few years down the line, one would have hoped, at the very least, this work would have commenced. And if an interview I did with the Minister of Monitoring and Development over a week ago is anything to go by, there doesn't seem to have been much, if any, movement. I don't know what you know, but as someone who has some insights and who closely monitors this space, I would imagine you would know whether in fact this exercise has even commenced.
Yeah, well, of course, Dr. Fikeni will know a lot more about the inner workings than I do, being chair of the Public Service Commission. But I do know that tonight or today sometime, the new framework document, which government has been working on, was released, and I think it needs to be acknowledged as I think it's too early to call it historic, but nonetheless it's a milestone. It's an important milestone. It sets an agenda which I think is profoundly important, and it says things which are fundamentally important and haven't been said in 30 years of South Africa's democracy. So and it's something which I take personal great pride in. It's something which I've been banging on about for at least 10 to 12 years now, and no one's really been listening. And finally, it looks like people have paid attention and are pursuing the kinds of reforms which I think are fundamentally necessary. And let me just point what I think is important. So when President Ramaphosa talked about size and form, I think this question of form is absolutely critical. And by form, what we've had and what we've inherited from the apartheid past and what was not changed during the post-apartheid period was the degree to which our public service was politicized. I expected that one of the fundamental reforms of 1996 or the late 1990s would be to introduce a meritocratic public service appointed on professional criteria with the coming into power of the African National Congress. And that's precisely what did not happen. What this new framework document does for the first time in our democratic period is that it puts professionalization on the agenda as a question of distinguishing between political office and administrative office. In other words, wanting to create a professional public service which is to some extent insulated from inappropriate political interference by politicians. I think that is a historic, well, as I said, it's too early to call it historic, but it's an incredibly important milestone, and I I take great pride in that moment. I don't think Dr. Fikeni would deny me my moment of pride in this regard. He knows that there have only been a few of us who've been pushing for this for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Dr. Fikeni, I mean, the president talks about reviewing the configuration, number, and size of national government departments, which is one part of the exercise. But I want us to start with, precisely because I mean this conversation happens on the back of the current wage negotiations, and as I said earlier in my introduction, part of the government's argument is that if it was to give more to the workers who are in the system currently, there won't be money for the additional numbers that are needed. Whether it's police or nurses or teachers or any other category. But what we don't know, certainly from where we are sitting, is whether there has been an exercise to determine the sort of numbers of teachers we need to have, where they should be placed, and so on. And the same goes with all the other categories, going all the way to your state-owned enterprises and other entities. As far as you're aware, has that been done? In other words, a determination of the numbers of employees we need across the government, and then secondly, whether an exercise has been done to determine the numbers of departments and ministries and the likes that we need to have for the country, or the size and shape and form of a country that we are.
Well, there is a lot of work that has been done, but very often it's fragmented. What is most important here is not only a determination of how many teachers, how many police, and so forth, but rather a trend analysis, a sequencing and prioritization as to what is needed as a catalyst to make other things possible. And not only that, with the fourth industrial revolution coming in, some new skill set needed in the foreseeable future. Let me give you one simple example. We met recently as the Public Service Commission with the Minister of Police, and he had brought in his entire team of senior leaders within the police and different units. One of the things was the analysis of the law enforcement, the criminal justice, as well as the, crime that is so prevalent in the country. And you begin to say there are certain components such as your forensic laboratories. How are they working? How are they coordinated? How are they capacitated in order to solve some of these crimes? You begin to see that over the years, the population has grown to close to 64 million, but the police numbers have been going down. The defense force numbers and their capacitation in terms of resourcing has been going down. So that in itself, when you say we need additional capacity, is very important to look at what the demand is there. But there's not been a consolidated form of study in terms of what the needs are in different segments. That's why having a single system, well-coordinated department like the Department of Public Service and Administration could do a wonderful job in terms of overseeing that particular exercise, perhaps even working with the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation to say what is the need today, what will be the need in future, and what are key things in the recovery from the state where we were in terms of stimulating growth, inclusive growth, and so forth. So those are some of the things that we ought to say, given the fiscal constraints, What are priorities? What are efficiencies that we ought to have?
And have you been able to answer the very last questions that you posed?
To the extent that there is a lot of fragmentation, each department wanting to do its own thing, and some saying we're not governed by this set of laws. If it's local government, it will do its own thing, and it will also make its own determination. And if it is the SOEs, the state-owned companies, they will do their own thing. That's not the most efficient way of actually doing things. And at times, even when resources are made available, not understanding the ecosystem of how different elements would be working. Take one simple example. Department of Public Works is the one that secures office space and properties for all other departments. And ICT CETA is the one that is the main player in terms of providing the ICT for all other departments. So those departments which have this transversal role that impacts right across, that are so critical, you ought to be saying, not just numbers, do you have the right skills? Is there right coordination? So that you can begin to see the public sector working optimally. But also more important, do you have the right people across departments, across entities? So that one who is doing project management, you deal with project management without wastage, and they is able to have contracting without wastage and without much corruption. So those are some of the key things that we ought to say. What are the biggest risks? What are the areas of efficiencies that we can begin to have? Then you'll begin to have less burden in the system. Even the debates around the wage bill, I guess a more nuanced thing, though that is not our area, would be to say, when you segment different sectors and different categories of workers, where is the most money going?
Well, I mean, speaking of SOEs, and I quote the president from that maiden speech again, many of our state-owned enterprises are experiencing severe financial, operation and governance challenges, which has impacted on the performance of the economy and placed pressure on the fiscus. We will intervene decisively to stabilize and revitalize SOEs. Has that happened, Ivo?
Well, not yet. There's been some tentative moves of bringing in new senior managers into some SAEs, like in Transnet and Eskom. Transnet looks like it's in deep and profound trouble, so it's not certain that intervention has been successful. And Transnet and Eskom, well, as you know fully well, that I'm load shed tonight, so I'm sitting in the dark. That's why you have a still image of me. Things in Eskom are looking rather bad. So it's not clear that the interventions in the SOEs are bearing fruit. Can I go back to an earlier point, though, around sort of the macro structure of the public service, the structure and some of the broad patterns of reform which are going to be this new agenda potentially affects, and potentially also we can identify areas of resistance. So, take for example, one of the key reforms of the 1990s was to change the character of the civil service in South Africa into something that was less bureaucratic and more managerial. The idea that would be that the public service would be led by powerful, well-paid, well-educated senior managers who would have wide discretion in their departments to interpret policy, think of the best ways of implementing policy, to be light-footed like business sector managers. So we created something called the Senior Management Service. Now, in the original conception, that Senior Management Service was going to be about 1,500 people. By international standards, 1,500 people to run the public service is already very, very high. France has something like 100, less than 200. Chile apparently has less than 100. So 1,500 was already a huge number. But nonetheless, it's a specific, not a huge amount of people relative to 1.2 million. What's happened over the last couple of years, though, is that SMS function has expanded dramatically. So I don't know what the latest figures are. Perhaps Dr. Fikeni knows them, but it's sitting at over 10,000. These are the people that effectively run the public service. And it's in this area that politicization has been most serious. So if you want, the people the people that the ANC have deployed into key positions has largely been within the senior management service. So the question that arises, and I wonder if Dr. Fikeni has an answer because I haven't been through the document fully yet, is that many of our senior managers who occupy absolutely vital positions for the management and the orientation and the governance of key departments, including SOEs, many of them are the very people that have not necessarily gone through the appropriate appointment process. And also, these are the kinds of people that might not qualify in terms of the new appointment process, a meritocratic appointment process, which the framework document is suggesting. The question is, what is going to happen to all these people? My suspicion is that implementing this document is going to produce all sorts of quite alarming resistance. And the question is going to be, what are the political mechanisms or political measures that are in place in order to deal with the kinds of resistance which this reform process is likely to generate?
Well, I mean, I'll get to Dr. Fikeni to talk to that specifically in a moment. But what you've just said reminds me of something you wrote recently, where you are saying, in part, in places like China, oligarchs, or you say more correctly, plutocrats, have been catalysts of development. In South Africa, democratic institutions constrain the weakening administration capacity of the government departments and agencies. Hence, it better resembles a coup d'etat in the bureaucracy than a situation of corruption.
So that piece of work comes out of an attempt to understand, do some comparative work, think about South Africa in relationship to the experience of other countries. There has been a very, very important book that was published, I think it was 2 years ago now, by a Singaporean scholar called Yong Yong An. I'm sure I'm doing terrible injustice to the pronunciation of her name, but she published a book called The Gilded Cage, where she studies the Chinese civil service. But what's interesting about her book is that she brings South Africa into the comparison of the Chinese civil service. And her argument, interestingly enough, is that the Chinese civil service is monumentally corrupt. It's astonishingly corrupt. We had a conference recently where we had an incredibly interesting discussion around China with some important Chinese academics. And they said the same thing. The Chinese civil service is probably one of the most corrupt civil services in the world. And yet, what is interesting, that despite the corruption of the civil service, it's also highly, highly effective. So the paper that you're quoting from was an attempt to try and understand, if South Africa and China have similar levels of corruption, why is it that in China the civil service is so effective, where in South Africa the civil service is so ineffective in this regard? And the answer comes down to the questions which we were dealing with earlier, fundamentally the ability to professionalize the public service. So the Chinese public service, despite being corrupt, is highly professional. In South Africa, we have a corrupt political environment and an unprofessional public service. So this move towards the professionalization of the public service might be the fundamental initiative which will help turn South Africa around. But the question I'm putting on the table is that the likelihood of these reforms are generating quite substantial resistance, both from political parties, the African National Congress in particular, but also thousands of senior managers. I'm asking, we have to take seriously that how prepared are we for the kind of resistance which it will generate?
Have conversations gone that far, Dr. Fikeni, as to look at what may happen if the reforms are rigorously implemented, the resistance that Ivo is talking about?
Yes, I think Professor Chipkins is correct, and we've had discussions with him as well, even before I joined the PSC, around these issues. We must and should expect resistance, because when you professionalize, you are disturbing some other people's business models. You are disrupting patronage networks, but you are acting in the national interest, because all comparative studies around the world show that it's a professional, meritocratic public service that will get the work done, policies implemented, services delivered, and that it will do so irrespective of some of the fragmentations and sometimes weaknesses within the political layer. You have seen other countries where coalitions collapse again and again, but work still continues. And here in Britain, you have had now so many prime ministers within a short space of time, but if you go for service in a particular department, you get served because you have this professionalized public service. And that in itself, we do anticipate, but we're going to congregate again and meet to discuss specifically the implementation plan now that the framework has been approved, because it will have huge implications, as Professor Chipkins was saying, when we go to implementation, local government, different spheres and so forth. It has to have that profound implications. Incumbents, some of them may not like some of the changes that are coming in, and some of the people may try to resist. But those driving the process must have the grit, must have the stamina, must have the focus and the determination, knowing that it is in the national interest to have professionalized public service. Because once you have both political weaknesses and weaknesses in the public service at the same time, that's when you move and slide into a crisis or even a failed state. That's why it is a matter of an SOS to professionalize public service.
I mean, Professor Chipkin in his piece makes reference or makes comparisons with China, for example. I mean, he just reiterated, I mean, those why corrupt as China, as public service may be, it remains efficient. It delivers, and of course, he poses the question as to why, in our case, the opposite is largely true. But from what you know, Dr. Figeni, have any comparative studies been done from which, presumably, we can borrow some concepts, ideas, as far as you know?
Yes, there are a number of comparative analyses done, even by government itself, and even through research and think tanks. One of the things, if one were to take China as an example, besides being highly professional, highly efficient, despite all its other weaknesses, is that from the time of Deng Xiaoping right to the current present moment of President Xi Jinping, they developed a long-term vision and they stuck to it. It didn't matter that the Politburo was changing leadership. They focused on it, and there was institutional memory within the public service itself to carry it through. What happens in our case, leadership turnover, policy turnover, even within the same, governing party. So that is one of the problems that we experience. The second element to the Chinese experience, I would assume, the issue of patriotism, where people take pride and they understand national interests, and they know how to safeguard and advance it. But in the case of South Africa, for example, where you have some officials in Home Affairs as reported to have been selling citizenship for 500 rands, or critical documents with huge implications. That shows that we need to have a new consciousness and awareness about national interest up and above just the technical training. There is a certain kind of orientation, because even the people implicated in various corruption reports, whether it's PPE scandals, Zondo Commission, New Gen Commission, and so forth, you realize that some of the people there are well learned, but I do think that that consciousness and intrinsic embrace of principles and values and ethos of what it is to be a public servant, servicing people and being people-centered, becomes very key. I can talk about stability where you have had long-term for the DGs and the DDGs or directors and so forth. I can talk about the right appointments. So this framework, it's a bold attempt to address those. But again, as Professor Chipkins was saying, implementation will be the final test if it is done well.
Implementation will be the final test if it is done well. Professor Chipkins, in your piece, you make the point that at the end of 2017, when Cyril Ramaphosa was elected ANC president and subsequently the country's president, there was hope for a new dawn. But of course, 4 years later, there have been few results that we have seen. One wonders, given all manner of predictions about how the direction the ANC is going and what may happen come 2024 and beyond. What are the prospects of this process that Dr. Fikeni was talking about actually gaining speed, given there was a tendency of politicians is to hang on to whatever they can hang on to, which gives them power or influence. So the likelihood of the resistance that you were talking about actually happening increases dramatically, because I mean those cadres deployed or who are found of like comfort in certain areas of our public service and the economy are most likely to hang on to what they have.
So I think you've asked $1 million question. I don't want to sound like the rosy or blind or naive optimist in this regard, or perhaps the pessimist is in terms of what I want to say. But the truth is that as disappointing as the Ramaphosa presidency has been for many people in terms of its slowness, the seeming lack of direction, nonetheless, in the administrative front, there are several very important initiatives. They may have been developing slowly, but nonetheless, they have been put in place. One of them is this reform initiative, of which this framework document is the expression. There's several other. There's a movement towards procurement reform, working its way through the various systems. Then there are these initiatives within various institutions to reform, to professionalize the NPA, state enterprises. We've discussed some of them. I think. Well,
incidentally, I was reading a column by the person who heads leadership South Africa. And Busi was lamenting the fact that these reforms aren't moving at the pace that they should. And as a result, more and more investors have lost, not losing, but have lost a confidence in the state's ability to actually, drive the president and his government's ability to actually drive these changes, notwithstanding, what everyone says has been a good start or beginning.
But for you, I think it's even more significant than the slowness of it. I think it's also, I think these reforms are very much associated with Ramaphosa's administration. And if he goes, if he loses in December, I think these reform initiatives are dead in the water. That's my sense. But there's even a possibility. I mean, former President Thabo Mbeki raised it on the weekend that he might not even survive the Phala investigation. I mean, we are waiting for Parliament to make an announcement about whether he has questions to answer. If that is the case, he might be forced to step down. In which case, I think we're talking about the demise of these reform initiatives potentially in the next couple of weeks. So I think these weeks and months ahead of us are absolutely critical to whether these reforms proceed or not. And I think that, again, the stakes are very, very high. Over and above the public servants we've discussed that may well resist some of these initiatives, the African National Congress is almost certainly ambivalent about them. There are many within the ANC and from other parties as well, but principally the ANC, for whom the politicized structure of the public service benefits them. They're able to deploy, put into office allies, colleagues,
Exactly.
friends, sometimes even family. So I think they will be invested in the system, in the status quo as it is. On the other hand, especially for the African National Congress, this highly politicized public service has had catastrophic consequences for its ability to perform, its ability to deliver on its mandates. Sitting in the dark at night without water, for example. There are consequences of catastrophic institutional failures. So you've got a strange situation. For the very first time, ANC's electoral performance is now unmistakably linked to its ability to perform in government.
Okay.
So I think within the ANC and potentially other parties, there is a growing tension or growing paradox. There are those that will continue to support cadre deployment and a politicized public administration. On the other hand, it's having catastrophic consequences for government, and also it's affecting their electoral performance. So I think there are very, very substantial battles about to take place or are happening now currently. And the question is, which side are they going to fall in the coming weeks and months?
Okay. Professor Chipken, let me thank both of you for coming through for us this evening.
Thank you for inviting.
After the break, we seek clarity from public sector unions as to what exactly the state of wage negotiations is, and whether, as the acting public service and administration minister said today, there may be problems if the government and public service unions reach an agreement only after the finance minister tables his budget tomorrow. Well, a looming public sector strike that could seriously cripple the economy may well be on the cards. However, Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi still thinks it can be avoided. But according to the finance minister, though, whatever agreement can be reached between the government and Labour must be done before he tables his budget speech tomorrow afternoon. Well, that's according to the acting public service and administration minister speaking today at a briefing. Well, to clear the confusion, I do have on the line two of the public sector unions. I've got Mike Shingange from Nehau. I also have Claude Naika from the PSA. Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks very much for your time, and I really appreciate the fact that you could come through for us at the very last minute. I got confused as I was about to go on air when I read or went through a package we are carrying, where the minister suggests that from the note that he got from the finance minister, if any agreement that is not budgeted for and that is only reached after he tables his budget tomorrow, may just be unimplementable and probably illegal even. Just your thoughts. Can you clear the confusion for us, Mike?
Thank you very much. Good evening to your viewers.
And I must say that I don't blame you for the confusion that you are suffering from. First, let's say that the medium-term budget policy statement, it's just that. It's a mid-term budget statement. It's a supplementary budget. The real budget that deal with everything that has to accrue over a financial year is presented in February. The issue of the salary increase or the wage agreement in the public service, the implementation date is the 1st of April. We started negotiating some 7-8 months ago. Now you ask me, if it is only now, you tell me if it's only now in October, in the midterm budget speech, that we must determine the budget for the salary increase. Why were we negotiating all these months? What will have happened if we had agreed in April? What will have happened if we had agreed in June before October? Where will the budget have come from? So we don't think that it is. The second thing we want to raise is that never before, as a principle of collective bargaining, had to rely on the parliamentary pronouncements because there are institutions of collective bargaining or social dialogue that we have in the country, such as the SABC. That's where the conditions of the public servants are negotiated and decided on. Of course, we have seen over the past 5-6 years an attempt of preempting and circumventing the collective bargaining processes by pronouncing as early as February, even before the negotiation starts, to a point that when we start negotiations, those things have already been concluded. So the point we are making here is that we are not negotiating with Parliament. Whatever the minister pronounced tomorrow shouldn't necessarily be the one that determine what happened in the collective bargaining. Otherwise, we have no reason to have a PSABC. But the point to underline is that the budget in October shouldn't have a bearing for 2022-2021 because the financial year of 2022-2023 starts in 1st of April. It doesn't start in the 1st of November.
Okay. Now, Claude, I mean, yesterday you filed a notice to strike, and apparently you're supposed to meet with the employer at the CCMA tomorrow. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. We have filed notice yesterday. That's quite correct. A very good evening to you. Once the 7-day notice has expired, we will start our campaign as far as picketing first, and then which will lead to a full-blown strike action. I am aware that there's efforts by the state to get the CCMA to intervene in the process, but unfortunately, they haven't followed the correct process. In order for facilitation by the CCMA to take place, you need all parties to agree to that process. This hasn't been brought formally to the bargaining chamber. And secondly, some of the unions that are part of the bargaining council have still got to conciliate on the matter, and I believe that they will conciliate towards the end of the month, the 30th to the 31st. Only once that process has taken place, and if there's no resolution, then only we can have facilitation by the CCMA. But as I've pointed out earlier, there's no will from our side at this stage, or no indication to say that we want the CCMA to intervene. Our dispute process is ongoing. There's other unions that will commence with the dispute process at the end of the month, and then we will take it from there.
And I suppose you share Mike's view or sentiment that whatever happens in Parliament tomorrow, Finance Minister's notice to the acting Public Service and Administration Minister or not, what happens there tomorrow has no bearing whatsoever in what you engage with.
Yes, he's very quite rightly pointed out. I think if the employer, the government has taken us seriously, they should have budgeted as early as or before April and said, this is what we have on the table and we can negotiate. I don't think there's anything that's going to happen tomorrow or stated tomorrow is going to have an effect on the public service negotiations. We're too far down the line now in the negotiation process where we're at a dispute stage and we're ready to embark on the industrial action show In the next few days, I don't see anything concrete happening unless the employer can have a complete turnaround and say that they will revise what is the offer is on the table and that we could take back to our members and avert industrial action. Mike's completely correct. I don't see any changes happening once the announcement is made by the minister, or if there's any announcement on salary increases that's going to be made by the minister.
Mike, do you expect a change of heart from a government that reneged on a wage agreement that was concluded some years ago?
Well, we live in hope. We will always expect that we hope against the hope that they have a change of heart. However, the space where we expect the change of heart is that a conciliation, at least as far as ourselves, that we are still in the dispute resolution mechanism is concerned, is that on the 31st and the 1st, the government must come there, and if they insist that there's an offer on the table, as we have heard the minister say, they must then know that that offer is rejected, and therefore they must conciliate to try and improve the offer. We think that it is important to echo the words of my comrade there, that look, never before have we invoked the services of the CCMA before we go on strike. The PSABC have got a dispute resolution mechanism, which involves you declare dispute, you call for conciliation or arbitration or whatever you decide after the conciliation has failed. You don't call the CCMA and circumvent and undermine and override the dispute resolution mechanism that is enshrined in the constitution of the PSABC, unless you are determined that you actually don't recognize the PSABC itself. Section 1/5 of the Labour Relations Act only evokes the CCMA in the public interest only when there's a strike. We are not on strike as yet. We have not served the notice for the strike as yet. We don't understand why there will be Section 150 invoking by the government through the CCMA when we're still in conciliation.
Claude, we've run out of time. Quickly, 5 seconds. What happens after the end of the 7-day period? Are you going straight on strike if, of course, there's none of the processes that the government is also talking about yields anything?
Yes, if there's nothing concrete coming from government, unfortunately, nobody wants to embark on an industrial action, but that's the only avenue available for us. And once the 7-day notice has expired, we'll be embarking on a picketing process leading up to a full-blown strike action. Okay. And thereafter, we'll have to assess it on a day-to-day situation.
Claude Naika, Mike Shinanga, thank you so much for agreeing to come on at this very last minute and for clearing things up for us. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Unionists Claude Naika and Mike Shinanga. That's our program for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.